Good evening, students. Welcome to our second part of the French Revolution lectures. Please take notes as it follows on the next slide about the French Revolution Stage 2. During tonight's lecture, we will be talking about Stage 2, first stage symptoms. During the lecture, record the detailed information as it fits into each category as stated by the prompt. And please provide specific details for each of the 5 categories. Each of the 5 categories is also labeled on the top of each slide to help you better understand. Now, before we talk about the immediate causes of the French Revolution, it's best to understand what French society itself was like. The long-term causes of the French Revolution is number one, the idea of absolutism, what we discussed before. Basically, the unjust political systems of France, what we call the old regime. There had repeated poor harvests that left peasants holding a large bill for taxes that they were unable to pay. And then we started to have the influence of the philosophers questioning the old regime. Also, the idea of mercantilism, which basically restricted trade with only French colonies. And then there was the influence of the Glorious Revolution in England and the American Revolution that we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. To start, we're going to focus on the short-term causes of the French Revolution. So step one, economic and social breakdown. So first off, bankruptcy. The French government was bankrupt. Why were they bankrupt? Because they spent way too much money on themselves and on wars. Many of government officials, specifically Louis XVI, brought in different financial ministers to look at the finances of the government and propose changes. Many of these changes had to center around taxing the first and second estate, but presumably they were rejected. Why were they rejected? Because wealthy people did not want to pay taxes that they did not feel they had to pay. The second major cause was a social upheaval. This was caused by the worst famine in memory that started in 1788. This famine, which essentially means that people were starving from lack of food, left people in a very desperate situation. The peasant class was hungry and impoverished, and they feared that the Estates General or the nobles at the Estates General would be seeking greater privileges. In response to this, peasants began attacking nobles throughout the countryside throughout 1789, oftentimes even burning down their estates to free themselves from taxation. In response to this, Louis XVI called the Estates General, which is essentially France's version of Parliament. It had not met since 1614, and this was set into motion an event that would essentially lead to the end of the monarchy in France. So to deal with the economic and social problems that were in France, Louis XVI called the Estates General. The Estates General was the closest thing that the French government had to a parliament, although it had not been called since the reign of Louis the XIII in 1614. So, in the winter of 1788 and 1789, members of the Estates General were elected from each one of the estates: your first estate, your second estate, and your third estate. A traditional list of grievances was written out by the people. It was nothing out of the ordinary. Essentially, it was calling for a little bit more taxation on the wealthy and a little less taxation on the poor. It was just moderate changes. The Estates General would commence this meeting on May 5, 1789. Voting during the meetings would be conducted by estate. Each estate would have one vote. That meant the first estate with 2% of the population and the second estate with 1% of the population could operate as a voting bloc to stop any reforms that the third estate, 97% of the population, would essentially have and try to get its way. Basically, you always had the more privileged estates blocking the less privileged third estate. Now, representatives from the third estate demanded that voting be done by population. This would give them the advantage, but it would also give the advantage to the vast majority of French citizens. This would, however, did not work. It deadlocked in the result, and eventually the third estate would be kicked out. So this diagram does a very good job of demonstrating what that voting block would have looked like. That brings us to the tennis court oath. Step 2, the first symbolic act of revolution. Now, the third estate decided to declare itself the National Assembly. Upset with the voting rights, they decided that they were going to create their own parliament, whether the second and first estate liked it or not. Louis XVI responded by locking them out of the States General, saying, well, you can't meet here, so you can't be an assembly. The third estate responded to this by relocating to a nearby indoor tennis court where they would bang down the doors, and they decided that they would write a new constitution for France, and that would declare itself a constitutional monarchy. So on June 23rd, 1789, Louis XVI relented, and he ordered the three estates meet together as the National Assembly and vote by population on a constitution for France. The new constitution would be produced. It would be called the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, and France would be officially a democracy on par with the United States and England for the time being. This is a very famous painting signifying the tennis court oath. So this is an example of the tennis court oath, of what was actually said, that would forever transform the French government into a republic. Now, Louis did not actually want the Constitution written, and because he did not want the Constitution to be written, rumors began to prop up that he was going to use military force to bring down the National Assembly and to attack Paris. And so on July 14th, 1789, people of Paris would storm the Bastille prison, which was an armory and a prison at the heart of Paris, and to steal guns and to free the political prisoners that were there. This is forever the flashpoint of the French Revolution, where July 14th is celebrated much the same way as July 4th is celebrated here in the United States as the Day of Independence in France. So the writing of the new Constitution and the storming of the Bastille would forever change things in Paris. Now Parisians would organize their own little miniature governments within the city called communes, and small groups or factions would compete for control of the city of Paris. Essentially, Paris was being given away to the mob. Now, with this happening in the city, uprisings began to spread throughout the countryside. Nobles would be attacked, records of feudal dues and taxes owed would be destroyed, and many people would just burn down the houses of the nobles in the countryside. Many of the nobles would flee France and become known as émigrés, or people who were displaced. Louis XVI was forced to fly the new tricolor, which was the symbol of the Estates, of the Estates General and the National Assembly, and the new flag of France instead of the traditional fleur-de-lis. This is the tricolor. Now we are on to step 3, where the government can no longer stop the rebellion. Now, as the Parisian communes gained power, they feared that Louis XVI would have foreign troops invade France to put down the rebellion. After all, Marie Antoinette was the sister of the Austrian Emperor Leopold. and it was feared that she would initially call on her brother to bring troops into France to put down the rebellion. At this point, on October 5th, 1789, after hearing a rumor that Marie Antoinette was hoarding grain at the Palace of Versailles, a group of peasant women marched to the palace and attacked Versailles, hacking to death many of the Swiss guards out front. They forced the royal family to march back into Paris with them, where they would be stationed at the Palace of Tuileries for the remainder of their life, where they would essentially be prisoners of the Parisian mob. In terms of prisons, Tuileries is a pretty nice prison. Now we're on to step 4, the changes under the National Assembly. What were they actually fighting for? So what they were looking for is, number one, the abolishment of guilds and labor unions, basically getting rid of tiers for working, the abolishment of special privileges for the First and Second Estate, adopting the Constitution of 1791, or the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, equality before the law for men, not women. Many nobles left France to become émergés. There was reforms at local governments, and now the taxes would be levied on the ability to pay the tax, specifically more or less an income tax, than just a simple tax that essentially starved out peasants. Now, in politics, we get the idea of left, right, and center from the French Revolution. The very radical people met on the left of the meeting halls, where the conservative people would meet on the right, and the moderate people would meet in the center of the meeting hall. So France would now become what we would call a constitutional monarchy, with a new constitution called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And what this declaration provided was freedom of religion. You no longer had to be a Catholic. Freedom of speech. You could speak out against whoever, whenever. Freedom of the press. You could write whatever. You guaranteed property rights to the people, and gave us the slogan for the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity, also known as brotherhood. The rights of the people to create laws, and a right to fair trials. Now, none of this seems radical, but these were all laws that were lost to the people with the French royalty government that was beforehand. Now, during the revolution, women would also push for their own rights. Specifically, journalist Olympia de Gouges, who wrote the Declaration of Rights of Women, essentially pushing for a recognition of women's rights. For the most part, with the exception of some property rights and the right to divorce, women's rights would be ignored, and this would actually cost the lives of a few of the male revolutionaries. And just like that, French government was changed on its head. And step 5, the moderates attained power, starts with the end of special privileges. Church lands would be seized and divided and sold to the peasants. A civil constitution of the clergy required that church officials be elected by the people, with salaries paid by the government. 2/3 of church officials left rather than doing this. All feudal dues and tithes were eradicated, and all special privileges for the First and Second Estate were now abolished. The country of France itself would be broken up into 83 new departments, or essentially counties, with elected governors rather than what we would call the petty tyrants or the intendants of beforehand, which were holdovers from the medieval age. There would be new courts with judges elected by the people to be established. And lastly, although they kept the king for the time being, it would be a limited monarchy. Essentially, Louis would just be a figurehead. All laws would be created by the legislative assembly. Feudalism as a whole, the title, marquis specifically, would be abolished. Undemocratic features, such as voting, was limited to taxpayers, unfortunately. Officials were reserved for property owners. But this new government became known as the Legislative Assembly, and the old regime would be forever abolished and destroyed. This is the good times of the French Revolution. Unfortunately, as we'll see tomorrow, it will not last. So make a prediction. If we know the revolution does not stop with the creation of the Dobermac, or the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which would have been a good place for the French Revolution to stop, what causes the French Revolution to grow to the more extreme, and what causes it to fall apart? Please make a prediction and be ready to share tomorrow.